Welcome to Layers with Larry. I'm Larry. These are my layers. Today, I'm going to focus on something you're all experienced around here, especially if you've ever been to Yellowstone, and that is the natural history of hot springs. Not all hot springs are hot. I should say maybe mineral springs, where mineral-rich water just sort of appears out of the ground in various places. And you all know that there are places up Shoshone Canyon, just west of Cody, where you can see that. And down in Thermopolis, there's certainly a great developed hot spring there that you can visit and probably have. And then Yellowstone, of course. Hot springs in general all derive from the same source, and that is from water, which has landed onto the Earth's surface. And depending on the rocks it lands on, most rocks are permeable or porous to water to some degree, and the water percolates down into the ground, and it can travel quite far down into the ground. And in fact, depending on the layers and how they're arranged and what they're made up of, whether they're sandstone or limestone, which is two common things you would find around here and do, those waters, as they move through those layers, pick up a lot of minerals, dissolved solids, things like calcium carbonate or calcite. Also, a related material called calcium sulfate, which is called gypsum. And often hot springs contain a combination of the two. Now, when that water passes down into the ground around here, you don't have to go too far down before you start running into pretty warm rocks. They get warmer as you go west towards Yellowstone, of course, where the magma is relatively close to the surface. So you've got some really active and really hot springs. You've all heard stories about people accidentally falling in, and unfortunately people actually going in on purpose. They call it hot potting, I believe, and being killed in the process, because the water can be as hot as 275 degrees Fahrenheit and contain other minerals like acidic things like sulfuric acid and hydrogen sulfide, things that are very caustic and can actually dissolve human flesh. And so you don't want to be doing that. Now, here by Cody, about the Damaris Hot Springs, and that was originally developed here for people to utilize because it's not so hot. We're quite a bit farther east, and the magma chamber is much farther down, and so the water that percolates down through the rocks around the Cody area doesn't get quite so hot. I mean, the farther down it is, the hotter it is, but as it follows layers and eventually finds its way up to the surface, particularly along places where there are faults. I'm going to show you a diagram here showing a side view of some of the layers that you might find around the Cody area. And you can see that on one side they're tilted way up, and on the other side not so much. And so the layers are offset along this fault, and water that moves along one layer can actually end up getting into that fault area, end up in a different layer, and eventually find its way out onto the surface. Which for us around here is usually along the river, because that's the first place, the lowest place that water is going to come up to the surface. So you won't find hot springs out in the top of the rocks along the canyon, because it can't fight gravity. It can't be pushed all the way up to that surface. So we look along the river bank to find the outcrops where the springs have come out. Now, when that water comes out onto the surface, depending on how mineral rich it is and what temperature it is, let's say it's fairly warm. So when that warm water comes to the surface, it cools very quickly, and it also starts to evaporate. Now, when you have dissolved minerals in the water, usually in very high concentration, they're often what we call supersaturated solutions. Like when you've made rock candy before, you take water and you put a lot of sugar in there, so much sugar and at a high temperature that you've got really more sugar dissolved in there than it should be able to hold because of the high temperature. It makes that possible. But when you start to cool it down and you put something in there like a string, you'll start to see crystals start to form in that, because that sugar, as the solution cools down, the sugar cannot be held in solution so well. So it starts to crystallize out. So in the hot springs, the same kind of thing happens. When the hot spring water comes to the surface, it cools. The minerals, the calcium carbonate, the calcium sulfate start to precipitate out. And along the canyon, there are many places, like in the area just back behind the rodeo grounds, where you can find old extinct hot springs out there. You'll see a big sign out there called Coulter's Hell, and it explains how that came to be. And those are all extinct hot spring areas, very similar to what you'd find in Yellowstone today, when the magma apparently was closer and the water was much, much hotter, and there was lots more of it. Things like this and this are formed, like you've probably seen at Mammoth Hot Springs, where the calcium carbonate and sometimes calcium sulfate combined come out and precipitate and form these rock structures called travertine. Now, the hot springs we're talking about now, like up in Mammoth Hot Springs, are fairly recent things, on the order of thousands of years old in some cases, or still being formed like they are today. Hot springs were around a long time in Turkey, in the country Turkey, which was but known to the Romans as a place called Anatolia. There's a famous hot spring that's still there. You can go visit it. There are ancient ruins there, ancient temples, and hot springs very similar to what you'd see at Mammoth Hot Springs. The place is called Hierapolis. That's a Greek word that literally means holy city, because hot springs have always been in human history a place where people sort of associated with magic or the occult or religions. Hot springs, but you can't see underground. Hot springs are pretty mysterious things. They produce strange smells. They produce water, which in some cases you could actually drink if it's not too rich in dissolved solids or nasty things like hydrogen sulfide gas that smells like rotten eggs. The Greeks developed it back around the 2nd century BC. It's considered to be the gateway to the underworld. Now, the Greeks' underworld was ruled by a guy named Hades, and they believed that was a portal or an entrance to that world. Famous people, Roman emperors, Greek kings, and other people of means that would want some knowledge about the future would often go to places like this, because there were priests there who would interpret what the god or goddess had to say about what the future would be to these people. Matters of state, wars, marriages, all kinds of stuff would be controlled or affected by what people believe these priests and priestesses would have to say. Now, back in Roman and Greek times, of course, these were pagan gods and goddesses. We know people believe there were multiple gods and goddesses that control all aspects of our lives. In the 4th century AD, Christianity was taking hold in that area, and a Roman emperor named Theodosius I outlawed paganism. And so a lot of these ancient sites and temples were torn down, and the portal to the underworld was covered up, and it was forgotten. Until archaeologists came in relatively recent time and rediscovered the springs, which are still active there, and the gases which emanate from there, which in the case of Hierapolis were mostly carbon dioxide gas, which you don't want to be around to breathe a lot because there's no oxygen in it. You would just suffocate. And animals that would go into these areas would die, and people believe that they were killed by the gods and goddesses that are ruling that hot spring. There's another really famous hot spring area that some of you may have been to if you've ever gone as a tourist to Greece. In Athens, or near Athens, there's an oracle of Delphi, where people, again, from all over the world, including Roman emperors and Greek kings and so forth, would go there to receive prophecies and predictions of the future, again, related to all kinds of matters of state, personal matters. There was a person called a medium, and she was always a woman, had to be over 50 years old and not live with her husband. I don't know what that was all about, but she would be down in a kind of a grotto underneath the temple up there, and it was a temple to the god Apollo. One of the things that Apollo is known for is being a sort of a god of truth and prophecy, among many other things. Now, when people went to Delphi to get a prophecy, there were priests there with something to write on and write with, who were waiting when the medium was asked a question. She would go to a trance-like state, and she would say whatever she said, and they would record it. And then later, she would come out of the temple towards the end of the day. If you asked her what she'd said, she wouldn't even remember. So we always wondered, well, how was that possible? When the archaeologists went in and dug up the Oracle of Delphi, kind of like they did with the Oracle or the temple at Hierapolis, they found that it was all built up over an area that was a fault zone, we talked about just a moment ago. And in that fault zone, we find hot water coming up. So there's a hot spring there. And there are gases associated with that water. Some interesting gases there. There's methane, which is natural gas, and that's not unusual. Not a good thing to breathe either. But there's also a gas called ethylene gas. But in the case of the Oracle and the medium in the Oracle, these two gases are toxic and kind of poisonous. They would eventually kill her if she stayed in long enough. But she's only in there long enough to have the effect of spouting gibberish or whatever the priests interpreted as prophecies. And recorded these things for the people that paid for it. After all, it was a business. These priests aren't doing this for fun. And just like you got to pay a fee to go up to Yellowstone to see the hot springs, you had to pay to go see the medium at Delphi as well. So if hot springs are associated with all these toxic chemicals and gases that are emanating from them. What about Yellowstone? You've all been there. I've been there. I've smelled strange smells, like rotten eggs. That's hydrogen sulfide gas. That's very poisonous. So how can you go up to Yellowstone then and not be affected by this? How come you're not standing around a hot spring like a medium in Delphi and spouting all kinds of gibberish and people recording those amazing things you're saying? Well, those kind of gases are there, but you know, it's not an enclosed space when you go. And if there was a hot spring in a very low basin-like area and it was very cold and there was no wind and the air just settled in there and stayed there, then that area would be highly toxic. If you walked down into it and you stayed it for a period of time sufficient for you to breathe enough of that stuff, there's no oxygen, so you'd pass out from that alone. The hydrogen sulfide is toxic and caustic and corrosive, and you would die. But you notice when you're all those places that you go to, that you never go to places like that. You go to places that are pretty wide open. If there's any kind of breeze at all, then all these gases are being moved around and diluted into low concentrations, and you don't spend a huge amount of time up there. So there's nothing to be afraid of. So I hope you enjoyed this little talk about hot springs, and in a couple of weeks, as we get closer to Halloween, and the timing is not accidental, we will focus a little more on the cave aspects, and there's a connection between caves and ancient beliefs and spirits and demons and ghouls and goblins and Halloween, October 31st. Catch you on the flip side.